we could do is we can just probably start, and if more people show up, then
Yep. That'd be great.
We'll roll with it at that point. All right. So yeah, what I was. All right. So
Go ahead.
I went to Berlin for this Emerge gathering, and my main purpose was to be able to learn from these complex ideas in social organization and development in both psychology and sociology, in order to try to import those ideas into the U.S. to improve the political, socio-cultural, and economic system we have here. At least that's. I don't mean to frame my work quite so narrowly, but that's. If you don't try to boil the ocean, then at least that might sound doable. So I'm trying to do these like pilot programs for some of this stuff, and that's the frame that I'm going to be looking through. I wanted to bring in other people that give what they were seeing as well. All right, so the first day we had these activities that to help us understand and participate in this we space, and it's the sort of thing that you really only understand if you were doing it. So Phoebe Tickell of the Moral Imaginations had us go through these exercises, and but what we got out of it was, that there, I think, can be principles that you can apply to organizations and groups to make things work better, to be able to collectively understand each other. I also joined George Poor's breakout sessions involving the purpose of that was to brainstorm on how we can enliven social ecosystems. And he did a session on this on Saturday and Sunday. And he was asking, okay, so how do we do this? How do we scale this up? That we have in a small circle. And in fact, this is something we're doing right now. We are learning from each other. We are being able to have this collective sense making, but how can it scale up? So there were similar themes. In fact, this was probably, I think that Jonathan Rowson wanted to leave open the theme of the weekend. But he was considering saying that it was about, imagining this we space. And that was kind of the unofficial theme. So not just how do we feel each other better when we are present with each other, and how can we be mindful of that and have more, deep sense making of our inner worlds and recognizing this space between, but also how can we bring this out to society at large and scale it up, so that was quite specifically what George Poor was asking in his 2 sessions that he did for enlivening social ecosystems. And what I think the thing that really came out of that was that if we have the right social, structural, functional organization of people and agents within a social network, where some people are playing some roles of perhaps a leader or moderator or creator, and other people are playing other roles. And if you have those roles coming together the right way, then that can be fractalized into a large, and it can grow from there. And that's not necessarily to say that any person needs to stay with that role permanently. You can switch roles. You just probably need to make sure that there's those different roles are all present, and then it can fractalize, and there's quite a bit more to it. It's a little bit hard for me to explain, all of that right now.
Were there examples or many examples of things that sort of point to that says, hey, this is heading in the right direction, or these are the kinds of things that have started to emerge that look like they would be able to propagate into some sort of system? Were they pointing to particular examples at all, Brandon?
Yeah, so let me see if some of the other people who were at the conference who had joined could maybe answer that, better than me. I'm not necessarily one who is super articulate and came up with, the best way to answer these questions. Some people, in fact, it was Robert Cohen and Ryan who told me that I'm good at herding cats. I'm not necessarily the one who can answer all the best questions in real time. So
we all have structural functional roles, right?
Yeah, Jeff and Shelley, you guys were both there. Can either one of you speak to Greg's question?
I would say that the presentation that Indra, and I have to say it was such a collegial time that I'm only remembering her first name right now.
Adnan, Indra Adnan.
Thank you. So her whole presentation, Greg, was on that community models, CANs. So community
action networks.
Action networks.
Ah, okay,
and
nice.
So what I took her main invitation to be was first to recognize that most people don't experience agency in the larger society and the larger politic. And so most people abdicate into, blame, disinterest, complain. So what's the mechanism for that change is local community organization that is actually kind of theme or need based, which then becomes a context where people get it that they have agency. So it's like an agency reconstruction project through everything from like the local soccer league to the neighborhood garden group to a political action group.
Right.
And she spoke about supporting that and then coordinating those systems to create an alternative polis. So a parallel path. She talked about two legs. So rather than a revolution model, a model of let's organize, let's support each other in organizing, let's knit these already functional groups together. And in that system, people get it that they have agency. And from that, there's an alternative way to participate than, I voted in the election.
Right.
So,
gotcha.
So in that context, Greg, she did name a whole slew of, this group and that group, and actually asked us in a small group to reflect on either where we're active in those kinds of networks or where we might even make a commitment to doing so.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I've been talking with a number of people in the Talk Society, Theory and Knowledge Society, about translating this into some sort of community action. I'm talking with Danielle about that and others. So that schematic is helpful, definitely, in seeing, yes, about cultivating on the ground groups that, can be brought together to sort of unlock a agency that is maybe latent. That's cool. Great. Thank you.
She used the term cosmo-local to thread the two together. And after her initial presentation, there were breakout groups because the conference was set up that way. There was all group like download or offering from someone. And then we would break out into smaller groups of different offerings. So one of the things that she did after her presentation was met with probably 25, 30 of us. And we broke then into smaller groups and spoke about what people are actually doing at the present time. One woman spoke about working in Africa to help feed villages. Because part of what Indra was saying is she recognized that when she went in to go help people find their agency, that oftentimes she would recognize that they were already, in fact, doing that. And it was just a matter of being in reflection and in wow and in recognition that then helped them know that they were already doing it. So to be really aware that that kind of top-down walking in to really help that community can sometimes be not necessary, but instead just lifting up what's already happening there and helping them weave with another community action network. So that was interesting as well.
Yeah, definitely. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, she in fact introduced a new word to us. It's ada, right?
ADA, ada.
Yeah, that comes from an Indonesian language, and it means the absence of fear, and that is related to this agency that we have, but we don't necessarily utilize. And she has a book out a few months ago that's it's called what was her book called?
We've got it. Where is it? Hold on, he'll go get it.
Yeah.
And Ada, I also kind of got, Brad, that it was lack of fear from a deep place of faith, like being able to know that ultimately we're held and ultimately we're here and we're steady, even when what's on the surface looks like, pardon my language, a shit show. There's something that actually feels like you can root deeply enough where, because she was speaking about getting this term from Indonesian elders and villages where so it's a ancient, or not ancient, but it's a wisdom piece of indigenous cultures. And so that's where she picked up that term.
Aga.
Yeah.
Great.
Waking up.
Waking up. Okay, the politics of waking up. Great.
Yeah, I'm hoping her video does get published online. It was a very excellent speech.
She was a powerhouse. She's full on.
Yeah,
she's awesome.
Good. Okay.
And really inviting, not power at you, but power with.
Maybe I'll reach out to her and maybe do a podcast with her. Sounds really like a good.
You would not be sad if she said yes. She's a wonderful human.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Another thing you said, cosmo-local. I've heard the term rooted cosmopolitan. It just reminded me a little bit about that. And I think these kind of dialectical in the ground versus, and then feeling that the healthy bridge between what we're doing locally and globally. So I really like that cosmo-local. Very interesting concept.
It seems important in terms of this issue around scaling, because I would say one of the emotional dynamics in the gathering was the scale of the demand of the problem, or the scale of the crisis, right? So there were waves of, I would say, at times the conversation was about death. Right? What is dying? What might necessarily have to come to completion, right? And then at a scale that's emotionally daunting. So that Cosmo, as Shelley said, like, it's a shit show.
Yeah.
But it's hard to act from that place.
Right.
So really, right. So that call to both be able to hold that awareness and then also say, oh, am I actually interacting with my neighbors?
Right.
Totally. Like actually interacting with them. So
right. No, I really like that. Certainly been my in my own journey. That's been a high a salient dynamic, as it were, in relationship to zooming out, seeing global civilization collapse, figuring out how to relate to that in a particular kind of way. So I appreciate those reflections deeply. Definitely.
And on Saturday, there were several of these breakout sessions, and I didn't attend all of them, obviously, but I can tell you about the one that I did attend, which was hosted by Alexander Bard and Ellie Hain, about metamodernism, promises, and shadows. And then there ended up being so many people joining that we broke out even further into smaller groups. And mine, I happened to be at a table with Andrew Sweeney and Emil Einderfries of Hansi Freinacht, and he had an experience of kind of a misuse of metamodernism with a sex cult infiltrating an intentional community in Germany that he had been involved in, and then had to withdraw from when things were getting kind of crazy, and cultish. And that's the problem that can happen when some people are just so, enamored by this notion of development. Right. And, then people want development so much for themselves, for their their community, and the people who then feel that, those who seem to be more developed are the ones to look up to. And it just can turn into a big, a shit show with cult-like behavior and stuff going on. And I guess this particular person who was, the perpetrator of a lot of these alleged crimes was a very highly complex thinker, but, not exactly the most ethical person. And so that's a concern, so how do we
wouldn't be the first time. That's always going to be a dynamic and navigating the especially big change spaces. There'll be opportunities, and there'll be opportunities for manipulation. There'll be opportunities for shadow, all of that. I'd be curious if they named, did they give any outlines of the metamodern shadow that they saw? What kinds of, is it this sort of like hiding behind your wish for development and being better and really, I'd just be curious if any forms emerged out of that.
No, they did. And in fact, when we recombined, and so Ellie took questions of and summarizations from the different groups. And I don't know if I could, recount all of the main points in real time here. Someone was probably taking notes. You might reach out to Ellie Hain, in fact, for your podcast as well. She's doing some pretty amazing work with, using cultural memes to engage, young people in a lot of these. So I think her work is essentially like a scaffold, to help, like young citizens to become more civically engaged and more concerned about the we space, using essentially the same sort of thing that a lot of young people use on, with Instagram and various other things like that, so you're using those media that to do that, to introduce these ideas.
Another question I had, and certainly I don't mean to dominate, but I'm just really curious. So, so Alexander Bard and I have been dialoguing both on in some podcasts and then off camera about metamodernism. I saw on his list that he's like, he had some dramatic, ironic, sincere, I am a metamodernist move, because he's been critical sometimes of that. And I've been trying to track where that term is. And if Jonathan Rowson shows up, I definitely want to ask him. But I'm really curious to get the flavor for that term. Was there, because it caught a lot of fire, both from Lene Rachel Anderson and Hansi Freineck, and was certainly, I used that quite a bit. And then for a little while, it felt like it's getting overused. And then where was it going to go? And I'd really be curious as to where that was landing in the sentiments that around emerged.
Yeah, well, at that same event, Bard started off saying, I don't like metamodernism. This term, it's not modern. But
that's Bard. I know.
I come from a music where sometimes there was a band that had, good music, but a terrible name. And then, so I'm just embracing the name. I am a metamodernist.
Okay. Well, that's interesting.
I would say I would agree, Brandon. That seemed to be the senses. I went to the first half of that breakout that you were talking about, Brandon, and what I got was it's a functional label for that emergent consciousness, and Bjorkman used it at a certain point when making the overall map, the big scale development map around he has a beautiful expression, I think, which is we're building bridges into the fog. Which is very moving to me around.
Feels good.
But that fog space, he mapped the traditional kind of worldview, a modern / postmodern worldview as the second unit, and then this yet unnameable conception of reality as the metamodern. And he also said we could also call it the integral, which felt like just an accommodation. Like, let's not get caught on the language. If you want to call it integral, awesome. If you want to call it metamodern, great. But its nature is still, we can at best sense it. Rather than actually diagram it.
Right. Cool. Yeah. I'm drawn to the metamodern concept, and the term resonates pretty well with me. But it's interesting to see how it's playing out and whether or not it will hold or morph or whatever. But yes, I love the bridges to the fog. That's cool.
Yeah.
Jeff or Shelley, did you guys attend? I think you must have attended some of the breakout sessions that I didn't attend. So if you'd like, you can summarize some of that.
I did. No, I guess the one that I did, the Indra one, and I don't know if that was. Oh no, the one I started in the Metamodern reality, and then the energy was sharp and odd in my reality. So I zipped out of there and I went into another piece, which was actually delightful. It was 4 men who were offering embodiment, which was winning, because there was it's hard to get your body and your fiber and your being into this whole gig. You know what I mean? So it was really landing in, they offered breath, as they're 4 very different individuals and they are a team together. So one guy offered breath exercises. Another man offered a trust exercise where we were moving around with one another. Another one was like, what is your idea? What is your biggest dream that you've never told anyone? Like your craziest idea. And then we all stood in a circle and there was one person in the middle. And the idea was you would offer your idea, very vulnerable for many people, because it's like this harebrained, like, if I could imagine anything, this is it. And then the invitation was the folks on the perimeter of the circle would step in if you felt called to say, I want to help in this way. And this is a way that this idea could get activated. So it was really powerful in bringing individuals' imagination and, brilliance, even if it's kind of not even possible, but it put legs under it, which felt so empowering. And then I'm forgetting right now what the 4th one was, but it felt really rich to have a experience of fully embodied, maybe not directly, how are we doing things to save the world or to create new systems, but bringing the body back in, which I just felt was super important. So that was great. I love that. And then Jeff, you did a spirit gig with
Jonathan Rowson and Jamie Barstow.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, and that part of what, and maybe so you can understand why I would say it this way, is like my background is in personal growth, retreat work, psychological, spiritual, kind of small scale group. And what I was moved by was the 2 of them were talking about the spiritual, larger scale social interface. Like Jamie and his people, you may know this, they've over 300 members of the British Parliament have done an 8-week course in mindfulness. Over 300 members of Parliament and the House of Lords have done this training, including a segment on how to cultivate compassion. And I was just like, wow, like talk about the service of that.
Any chance they're willing to cross the ocean and do it in the US?
Right? I mean, what
do we need that over here?
Yeah.
Maybe.
And so the part of that was about what modifications to the spiritual frames and maps that fly in spiritual communities, what modifications need to be made so it's palatable. And I mean, Jonathan made, I think, one of the root distinctions was he doesn't use the word spirituality because it's too floaty up into the whatever. He talks about spiritual sensibility. And there's something that almost emotionally grounds people by the word sensibility. Like, oh, that's sensible. I'm prepared to engage with you. We're talking about sensibilities. And I also really heard from Jonathan that there's this weird void space in our political discourse. Like we can talk about certain human needs as a legitimate concern of politics, but you can so easily just step over the line and suddenly people are like, oh, that's not politics, right? Yep. Like housing and education, that should be the concern of politics, but what about loneliness? Or, we can talk about a welfare state providing care, but we can't use the word love. And so I really respected the work they're both doing to expand that, both to finesse what words will actually fly, but also to push the limit. So can we actually talk about love?
Right.
As in our political discourse. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah, no, those are deep conversations I think we need to have.
Yeah. The other thing I'd bring in is Elizabeth DeBold and Thomas Steiniger. So they led the entire group in a practice of the dialogic we process that they lead. And I think the report is it was highly variable depending on who you sat down with. The 8 people that I was part of, we went into a kind of deep space of communion. And I think, Shelley, you had said yours was kind of scritchy and choppy. But I did do a breakout session with them as well. And I noted that I have a lot of respect for that work. It's a lot of the work that Shelley and I do under a kind of different name. But there's a weird mix of, some of it is so subtle that and now I know I'm jumping a little bit, but maybe part of what I even got from the whole conference is there are some minimal ego development needs in order to be able to function in some of these spaces. So that kind of we space, collective intelligence listening it's profound when it functions, but it feels to me it's like easily interrupted by even 1 or 2 people in the set who are not at the level of development. I think Brandon and Shelley, we experienced that even when there was a fishbowl experience in the middle of the entire conference, that we could really feel the variability of what was being spoken. Some of it was actually pretty ego-driven. And so there was another day's work on Monday about inner development goals.
Yeah, before we get there, though, I wanted to give some remarks on that session with Elizabeth DeBold and Thomas Steiniger, because I was a little confused. In fact, my little breakout, they assigned everybody to a series of these circles, and there wasn't enough room, in the main hall for everybody to sit there and be in circles. So some of us were in the lobby. And Shelley, I don't know if you were in the lobby, but
I was in the main room.
Okay, so we couldn't hear the full instructions, and that's important. That's very important to set up the conditions for how these smaller circles are supposed to operate. And we were lost. We didn't understand what are we doing here. We started to talk on, okay, so we were supposed to speak to not any particular person, but the space between us. And so we were basically just kind of sitting there and nobody was saying anything. And when we started, I was like thinking, okay, I need to herd the cats here a little bit. Although I should also, this isn't supposed to be an ego thing. So I need to try to move us in a direction to based on the very limited information that Pamela gave us, because Pamela was in the main hall and came back over to us to relate those some of the instructions. But we couldn't understand it. We had these little pieces of paper to say a topic, but we weren't really supposed to get that much into the topic. Jonathan Rowson is here.
Great.
So we weren't supposed to get that much into the topic. But then ours was In fact, it was 2 pieces of paper because there was one group that was too many. So they gave us 2 together. And one of them said economics and the other said human development. So I started to say, in fact, this was just on the TOK list. We were talking about the convergence of these. And I started to kind of talk about this a little bit. And I said, well, this is how it feels like from an inner perspective. And maybe we can talk about this connection of inner perspective to economics and human development. But I don't know if I was introducing ego when I was doing that. It was a little bit lost on me. I think we were just silent for a long time, though. So it was a little confusing.
Right.
But anyway.
Hey, Jonathan. Thanks for coming, friend.
Yeah, I got my 6-year-old to sleep. So. All
right. Wonderful.
As soon as he fell asleep, I ran upstairs to join you.
You can take it away, Jonathan, if you'd like.
Yeah, actually, we'd love to hear your perspective on just on the development of the conference and how it went and what the takeaways were, and anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. Well, thanks. Thanks for setting this up. And well, where to start, really? I mean, there was the event in Berlin a couple of weeks ago. That's the third Emerge event, the third Emerge gathering, and I think by some way the best in some sense. There's a sort of prehistory here. I don't know how much you want to know, but the first event was in Berlin in 2018, and that was really a kind of like speculative, invite people within a kind of network to talk about what is emerging in the world. It was very, very open and capacious, like speculative, and it was also designed in a way that we would just allow things to emerge in the room. Like we wouldn't have a program. There were some skilled facilitators. We hoped that somehow the combined, I don't know, acumen and sensibility of the people in the room would somehow make sense of itself, and it didn't work. I think the general verdict is that it wasn't a success in 2018. I mean, of course, a bad event still leads to good meetings and good fun, and it doesn't mean it was a failure. It just means that it didn't really succeed on its own terms. And in the second event in Kiev, which is a very interesting place, Kiev, it's kind of right on the cusp now of East and West, and some think it's like Berlin was about 100 odd years ago. It's that was really good. I mean, it was a very lively event. It was a bit more emphasis on Bildung, a bit more emphasis on education. It's kind of the transformative aesthetic civic education as being some key feature of what it means to contend with the world's challenges. And then this year round, well, you probably already heard, there's lots of different currents in the room. So it's very interesting to ask what exactly brings people there. Like, what is the pattern that connects in Bitsonian language? There's different angles there. There's a sociological angle, an anthropological angle, geographical angle. So geographically, you've got quite a lot of German people, quite a lot of Swedish people, and quite a lot of British people. And then you've got a sort of smattering from other places, including Grandin, but also from France, from Spain, and various other places.
About how many people were there? What was
this
the total?
Around about 250.
250. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, give or take. But it could easily have been more, because what's funny about it is, we got to 250 on a ticket cost. I forget the exact. Was it 300, Brandon? I can't remember. But there was a ticket cost that was
about 200, I think.
Yeah, 200. Okay, so it was it was not a massive amount, but equally not nothing at all. And that we got lots of people signing up just with the name, like nothing but Emerge. So what I think one of the things that's going on, and with your clinical background, Greg, you may have a view on this, but I think that there's a kind of projection platform thing going on whereby Emerge is a sort of aesthetic attractor that pulls people in who see themselves in it. But they see themselves in it in a variety of different ways. And that's what gives rise to this. There's some degree of commonality, but there's a great deal of divergence. And the commonality is something like, we don't think we can make do and mend. It's something about a view of the world that we feel civilization as we've known it, of nation states and democracies and market capitalism, is somehow, even if it takes decades, kind of inexorably on the way out. And there's something else arising but we don't really know what it is. We might be somehow responsible for it. But of course, it's way beyond any individual to make sense of that. It's sort of gargantuan in its scope. But that's sort of what people share, that sense of something dying, something not quite being born. And on top of that, I would say there's a kind of spiritual, political nexus or juxtaposition going on, in which most people feel that the problems in the external world have solutions, or at least untapped resources in the inner world. Right. And again, not quite sure how to make sense of that, but people are drawn to that query. And finally, I said today in the group with, the Alexander Bard mailing list group, there's an interesting nexus around development, because I think one of the main founders, Thomas Bjorkman was the kind of initiator, but he brought with him a few people, including me at the beginning. And now I've got kind of overall responsibility for it, because Emerge as a kind of project sits now within Perspectiva as an organization. Right. But I mean, as I say, the concept won't be controlled in that way. It's beyond, I don't expect to be able to control it, but it's more that we make sure that the finances are sound, that people are there to deliver things, and that there's some degree of substantive oversight. Like, I don't want it. This is a very delicate task of like giving some organizing principles without denaturing the emergent process. Anyway, that's the lie of the land roughly, but there's more going on.
I'd be curious. I asked this earlier and said that I would check in with you as well. What was your sense on the concept of metamodernism? How did that play? Where is that these days in terms of, its own emerging evolution, et cetera?
So, I mean, here's where I'd love to refer to Exhibit A, which is an essay I wrote on the subject a few months back now, I guess. And that's the long answer. That's the sort of, 10,000 odd word answer. But where was that at the event? Again, it's one of these somewhat ambiguous attractors. It's as if this is a sort of very sort of back of the envelope theory of cultural evolution, but it's as if you get to a point in cultural development, and that can be a combination of the impact of COVID, our familiarity with the digital life world, some sense of ecological impending doom or governance breakdown, all of these sort of various features in play, gives rise to a kind of conceptual emergency in which we no longer have terms to make sense of our experience. So that might be meaning crisis in Vervaeke terms. I'm sure you have your own way of putting it, Greg, but there's this kind of sense of the language is not quite up to it. And so new terms arise out of that. One of them is metamodernism. And it does have its own intellectual integrity and lineage, more than one actually. And that's what I tried to detail in the essay. Like it's partly about a kind of antidote to hypermodernity. It's partly about something to do with cultural artifacts coming after postmodernism. It's partly Hansi's work and political developmentalism. Yep. But then it's also this umbrella term, and it's that latter sense that works in the Emerge gathering. It's kind of it's a term used as a big canopy to say what's coming next. It's an open question of what's coming next. Yep. And it's also saturated with what's already there. So it's not like brand new. It's more like we're completely enmeshed in all these cultural references, all this historical knowledge. And yet from that, we somehow feel something new has to be bootstrapped out of it. Where did it play in the gathering? More than I expected, actually. And Brandon might have affirmed that too. Like, I thought it was kind of a niche interest group of maybe like 10% of the people. But I would say it was more like sort of 30, 40% were drawn by that, whatever they think that term brings with it.
Cool. I have an affinity towards it, so I'd like it to be. I mean, to me, I think somebody did mention. Thomas mentioned bridge into the fog as an image, and then the metamodern feels like a nice placement relative to just the overall evolution of sensibilities, the way that Lenné talks about it in terms of metamodernity, and then at least a simplistic, integrative, pluralistic view of that transcends the modern postmodern divide. I hope it hangs on. I'm still it still works for me. I grew to love it in a sense. I think it has its own value. I just think it's important to realize that, as you just laid out, it does have these rich different currents within it.
the part of the challenge is that most people come to it from one of those currents. And so they think it is just Hansi, or it is just what, I don't know, whoever's using it at the time is doing. It's a sort of superordinate concept to, you know, contain and define many others. So,
other folks have questions for Jonathan as we're, you know, I mean, it's obviously an open thing, so.
I do, Jonathan. I was not there, but I am definitely a student of the collective and the we space, and your article on what we're up against, right? Human beings are the ones that are participating in this we space.
Right.
And after the gathering, did anything shift or anything open up?
So, Danny, I don't know if that's how I say your name,
Danny.
but yeah, Danny, yeah. So, well, yeah, I think you're referring, not everyone may know, I wrote this piece prior to the event called The Impossible We. And that was
Yes.
one way to try to kind of give some kind of substantive content, but one that was capacious and porous enough that people didn't feel shoehorned into anything. And what I was really getting at is that on almost any given collective action problem at scale, it has an injunctive quality that we have to act in a certain way. But the we is underspecified. So the we is the global we, including Putin and Xi and Modi and all of the major sort of authoritarian leaders of the world, lumped in with all the different democracies and all the different divides within those countries. And then, of course, we have our own intra-psychic kind of conflicts too. So the we is sort of radically contested in all ways, at all times, and yet we rely on it to mobilize action and galvanize action. So I was sort of speaking of the impossible we as a question mark, saying, what kind of we do we need to become to actually get serious about some of the collective action problems we face, principally among them the ecological ones, but including the epistemic ones that the Consilience Project's grappling with. And also arguably economic or public health or whatever else. And so did that shift? Well, what happened, I think, Danny, was not everyone got it, in the sense that what was difficult, what I was very keen to say is, it's not about the we in the room. You know, it's not so much about the group that's gathered. Now, as all of us know, we've been to many of these kind of events, inevitably group dynamics become part of the story. Whether you're at an academic conference about something relatively obscure, still questions come in about who's talking too much and who's taking the power and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So there was a bit about that, but I did think that the group started to realize what we were talking about, because there were several talks. One of them was Thomas's, one of them was by Indra Adnan, both of which alluded to the value spectrum from the Global Values Survey. So kind of empirical dry land of sorts, in which you can point out, look, there are groups that kind of share our values to a large degree, those who might be persuadable or amenable to cooperation, and then those who are really very different, and who may not have the greater good at heart. And there are a critical mass of people, many millions. And so when we're speaking of what we're going to do, which we are we talking about in that sense? In other words, what do we have to do? Not as if they were automatically going to be brought into the fold, but rather recognizing that there will be this perennial opposition. What then? Like, where does that leave us? What kind of collaboration do we have then, when we realize that there will still be kind of opponents? Yeah. And then some people in the room don't want to go there. They say, what are you talking about? That's division. Don't bring an opponent. Right. And I'm like, well, ultimately, that's the speech I gave at the beginning. Spiritually, we may be one, but politically, we're not. What emerges from that? That was the kind of question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Would you be anticipating another emerge in a year or two, or is that?
Yeah, almost certainly. We're just grappling now with how to do it, because I think there was a general sense that, although it worked well, I think a lot of the reason it worked well was just that it was the first major social event of like-minded people for a long time. So it was like we'd have to have done really badly to screw it up somehow. But I also think,
hey, Jonathan, let me just interrupt you from having been there. It was also really well led. So
Nice.
in terms of navigating 250 people, including dissent. So Pamela and Phoebe, who were kind of holding the dynamic, they were masterful in transparency about what's happening in the room, and yet holding to the through line. So,
well, thank you, Jeff. I didn't realize you were here. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
We do plan to have others, and we are we have been European, but there's no particular reason for it to stay that way. We probably want to do it somewhere other than Berlin for the sake of variety. On the other hand, there is a school of thought within the sort of Emerge leadership group, if you like, that Berlin's quite important. That I heard someone say the other day, and this is really like back of the envelope international relations, but they're saying, look, basically China wants to take over the world, and something's going to stop. Something has to stop that. It doesn't look like it's going to be the US for a while, because the US is caught up in its own internal dynamics that are going to take a couple of decades to resolve. I'm like, maybe, okay. And then he carries on and says, so it's going to have to happen in Europe somehow. But in Europe, he said, the only driving force there is Germany, but Germany is very conservative. So you need a kind of progressive engine within Germany, and the place you get that is Berlin. So that's where we have to be in Berlin. And it was kind of funny to hear this, brutal logic, which is clearly a bit bogus, but nonetheless quite interesting. So there's a case for staying there, but a case for venturing to other places. In terms of numbers, I think Thomas would quite like to have a really large group that was more about kind of bringing it to the masses, whatever it is. That's a big question. But also, or in addition to that, something more like 70 to 100 people, so that you have a better chance of really spending quality time with people, and more scope for unstructured time maybe. And on the other hand, we could just do something similar again and see how it goes.
Gotcha.
I mentioned to Thomas that I would perhaps like to help organize a similar event in the US, whether it be branded as Emerge or based on a similar spirit. And my first suggestion was, in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, where you have, so much wealth and influence, but poor sense making. And these people have, they are figuring out technological ways to capture people and to further denigrate sense making. I mentioned this to a few people, and some Robert Cohen and Ryan suggested that we do something perhaps in Colorado, kind of the middle of the country, so that people could come from all over without having to fly across the country. And that's also, that's where the integral movement is kind of based.
That's
so
that's
a possibility.
Wilbur Heartlands, yeah. Right. Well, I mean, look, this is the thing about the creation of Emerge. I mean, it's very much see what emerges, and if this is what's emerging, then it's very promising, and I would encourage you to go ahead. I mean, we're happy to talk about what works best in that sense. I mean, not precious about the brand as such, but equally good to understand what that would mean, and what plans you'd have for the event. And but yeah, I mean, there is a sense of time sensitivity, and we shouldn't. The other problem with the progressive world, very broadly conceived, and I don't mean to assume that we're all sort of progressive or whatever, but I just mean that for those who are interested in, in some sense, facing up to the challenges of the world and dealing with them collectively, and that can cut across political spectrum. There is a terrible tendency to factionalize and get obsessed with one's own particular micro project or identity project. We're very keen to move beyond that, and Emerge was designed as this. Although there, as I say, at the moment there is some operational and financial connection to Perspectiva, but really that's not because we crave it. It's because something's needed like that. So if we can find a way of making it a genuinely emergent multi-site operation that self-organizes in a mature and kind of genuinely cooperative way, fantastic. The challenge, as you know, is when you have lots of spin-offs, keeping control of any kind of message becomes difficult. But I mean, there isn't really a message as such. So as long as we can figure out what those core principles are and that they're shared, then I suspect we could just go ahead, you know.
So I put into the chat the idea of Emerge X by analogy with TEDx, where they maintained the overall brand, but spawned local instances of it. That might be a useful model.
That might well be. Thank you. Yeah, that could well be one way of doing it. I mean, it's also exciting, you know, because what I find really fascinating intellectually is people are drawn to something and no one quite knows what it is. You know, it's like, yeah, I find that really like curious. I don't want to explain it away, but you know, and Andrew Sweeney wrote this lovely reflection. I don't know if you've seen it, where he describes the experience as a bit like being at a post-religious church. In that, you know, there's a kind of, it's not as though there's a doctrine, but there's this kind of thing called metamodernism, which, you know, it sort of dangles in the air as we have to. And then there are people, one or two people on the stage that seem to have something to share. And then there's definitely a kind of confession going on. People are like catching up with where they're at in life. And there are a few rituals along the way, but, you know, occasionally asked to meditate, not exactly meditate, but to maybe imagine something or whatever. So I don't think it's not just that. There's also something with aesthetics that I don't fully understand. I don't think it's just the Emerge image and brand, but there's something about the mixture, like Andrew called it transgenerational, the fact that young and old are together. It's a bit post-political. Like I know there's probably a kind of, there aren't really many extremes there. You know, I don't think you have really a lot of hardcore communists or sort of hyper-capitalists in the room. Most people are there grappling with some sense of the world is not working quite right.
You know, Jonathan, I'd add to that what Shelley just said. I think a lot of the draw has to do with hope.
Right.
It is a response to the, I mean, that's what got me on my ticket across the Atlantic was a need, a kind of erotic need to be in community.
Right.
For the experience of there is a way forward and the elusive we, but to experience myself as part of we, as an erotic experience was, I think, a big piece of what was happening in the room. Right.
In fact, eros might well be one of the better terms to make sense of this. You know, the merger with reality at some level, that somehow things are more real, more vital, more alive in this place where the others are, and you find the others and you somehow merge with them, and thereby, you know, there's a sort of micro transcendence going on of some kind. But it's just meaning, you know, and I hear you. I don't mean in any way to diminish what you said, but there's also something that isn't that just socializing? No, it's more than that, right? There's something a bit more than just. It's the people who feel they're somehow responsible or called to have a higher order sort of reckoning with our historical moment, and they don't quite know what to do about it, but they share that experience.
Jonathan, I'm picking up on two things. All of a sudden, remember the concept of lifelong learning, right? Instead of, you know, you go to university, and that's where you have all the people, you have all the aliveness, you have the growing and the knowing, and then you're supposed to stop that, right? And there may be that this is some of what the call of this is, that there's wait a minute, we want to gather here, learn, but also learn by the Socratic method or the whatever, you know, in between each other. So I think that's possibly a draw. The other thing I just wanted to bring to your attention, Jeremy Johnson, as you know, and the Gebser Society, they just had, or they're currently having a conference, and they're using the term cosmo-local, and they are experimenting, and it is just beginning. How do you have a central presentation? At this point, they're doing it Zoom, but it could be Berlin, right? And and that then the breakout would happen at different times of the day that would be local.
Right.
Literally, geographically local, physical, whatever. And they're just beginning to play with it. But because the piece that hasn't come together for me is how do you then get the feedback? It's kind of what we're just hearing about Inda, what she was talking about is, having the local geography based that can then feed back in so that and there's the religion for me, it falls into, you're in a net.
Right.
Indra's net.
Indra's net, exactly. Yeah. I've heard that joke in that context a few times, but yeah. The thing that it reminds me of is a line of Jordan Hall's, actually. At some point, I forget, I think in the context of his writing on the Civium a while back, most of us will have gone through phases where people speaking about the city or the country as the main juxtaposition in life. Do you live where all the people are and the creative impulse is, or do you live where the nature is and where you have a bigger place, more freedom? Right. But what's happened, the digital world has changed that relationship. In some ways now, you have this sort of three worlds that we live in. The places where there's like the metropolises or the big gatherings, the quieter, secluded places where there's some kind of different energy, different kinds of resources. And then there's this, placeless place, the digital world. And somehow we haven't fully woken up to the fact that this third world changes our perception of space fundamentally. And what it might even mean is a kind of alliance of the relatively rural with the digital, giving rise to something almost as connected as the city. Right.
Yes.
And that's I was invited on the BBC. What was it again? Moral Maze, mate? No, what? I forget which program it was now. But it was a program. I think it was the Moral Maze. We were asked about, is the city dead? And I think the answer is clearly no. But it was in the context of the city's closing down during COVID. And I used this idea, and I think it's relevant in this context because somehow we've got to get back in touch with our places and the people near us, but not in the oppressive way of turning off the internet. You want to keep this vibrant global thing alive, but not get lost there either. Yeah. So there's some kind, we haven't quite learned how what that currency is yet.
So can you come up with a term? Because I really think it's important, again, to get, like, you have the three places, right? We know, let's say the nature, the city, the place. And what's the name for, the minute I say online, I swear people around me go, oh, you're online. Right. So
maybe
what is this? You said global, but I think it's more than that.
I mean, look, anyone who's guest here is as good as mine. I'm just recognizing that the spirit of what we're doing right now and what happened in Berlin, there's something about Berlin that was the eros of being together in the same room, right? It was precious and singular and cannot be replicated here, however great this may be. And yet they're now part of the same world. And I guess I'm just contending that we haven't fully caught up with that yet. Yep. We got one and the other, but we haven't really realized what the relationship is yet.
Well, I have a suggestion that perhaps this is a we space stack. Like there's the most fundamental we space is being in person with people face to face and having that, that collective sense making. There is just so much that you can get from that. Like, for example, none of us can look each other in the eyes here. There is so much of, there's actually a lot of interpersonal sense making that you get from directly looking at someone's eyes. There's a psychological and neurological basis for this. So obviously we can't reproduce that, on scale, across the world here. It is remarkable that we have this technology here that people were, imagining decades ago. Wouldn't it be great someday if we could have, video chat with people anywhere in the world? So we have this. This is a part of the stack. We do need these in-person events, and as long as there isn't, a major pandemic going on at the time, then we can sometimes meet with people, in a somewhat local areas, and perhaps occasionally go across the world. We don't want to do that very much since it does use a lot of, carbon. But and then at the highest level, we have just text communications. It's part of that stack. We want to make sure that we are properly grounded as necessary, even though I'm not going to very many times in my life probably be able to see Jonathan face to face, but I did, the other day, and that was great. I still haven't met Greg, a single time face to face, but perhaps a day will come. And then, so those connections form the solid basis for our continued growth, so that's what I was suggesting I'm not sure if this is answering the question that you were asking for a term. So I'm offering we-space stack, although I don't know if you were perhaps asking for a better term for something that is within that stack.
No, I'm looking for a better coining, other branding of what this online techno connecting Zoom, a better way to give it we say nature and all of us immediately can be there, right? So it's not to be answered now necessarily, but I just think making it a place, that's what made me think about it, Jonathan, when you said it's a place. So maybe it's getting the felt sense of that place. And I do agree with you, Brandon. We don't have the eyes, but what I'm pretty clear about is I work a lot with Thomas Hubel's study with him, and he's very much about developing our capacities to connect. Yes, we can't use the eye to eye, but we have other, whether it's our tone of voice, our gesturing, or whatever it is, that connects. So I'm looking for a better word for what this is.
Danny, if you haven't already, research the term metaverse.
Yeah, metaverse.
It's a very vague term
yes.
the art of the future.
Sure, and, I hadn't connected it that way. Yeah.
Facebook just opened their Meta meeting service very recently, so it's actually an instance of it. So you just take a look at that and see if those ideas are close to what you're looking for.
It's just an aside, but thinking about the eye to eye thing, it feels a bit almost mystical to me in some ways, because you can see my eyes looking at your eyes, right? And I can see your eyes looking at my eyes, but nonetheless our eyes can't meet. And there's something a little bit trippy about that, because it's as if the agency is outside of either of our heads. There's very much this betweenness thing going on. And that's what's lost digitally, which is magical in person. And I don't know what that is, but it just occurred to me that there's something a little bit, special about that absence. Anyway.
Thomas Hummel speaks of it as an extension of our nervous system.
Right. Yeah. Sure. I could believe that.
Just an extension, like we can know where the fenders of our car are. It's a proprioception almost. Right. That can be developed.
Which suggests our nervous system is not confined to our body, right? That it's extended beyond the between. Anyway.
In this strange metaverse, the other thing that's different from being live is I get to see myself as part of me. We're hanging out together. I never see myself.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
One thing we didn't touch on yet, and I'm not sure how much time we have, but there was a final day, which was the inner development day, right? Jonathan, I'm not sure if you were there for that.
No, I wasn't. I had to get home, but yeah.
But Jeff here was starting to speak to that, and I just perhaps a few minutes ago, or like about a half hour ago, but I wanted to make sure that we were fully digested some of the other things first. But if you'd like, Jeff, you can continue those thoughts.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm trying to remember what I was thinking. I found it very exciting so the Inner Development Goals is a project that's in response to the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN developed. So which is this kind of massive description of what's needed. And I found it very moving that here's a drive to articulate what are the interior capacities needed to kind of do that. So it seemed like an articulation of like what would the results of a successful Bildung be? Or what are the results of a successful psychotherapy, personal growth work be? And I'm part of what I do is I work as a counselor, and part of the gift of coming home is I'm like, I'm going to give this list to my clients as a way to kind of test, are we working in the arena that you actually want to be working in? So rather than being content driven, I'm struggling with my addiction, or, I've recently mourning a death, to shift it into kind of skill development. Like, if you want to be working on, for example, presence, or the cultivation of compassion, or clear communication skills, or capacities of agency. So it's a very exciting map. I don't presume that it's a unique mapping, but it's a strong one. And again, as an interface with exterior work, what does successful exterior work require? Let's start to be able to articulate it. And again, I think a helpful tool for development, for people to be able to self-identify. Oh wow, I feel the erotic call to that dimension of self-development. So.
I can tell you that at that event, I was in a breakout group where the question was, how do we have a more scientific way to go about social development? How can we, for example, recommend interventions to perhaps municipalities or small governments or small to medium-sized businesses that they can, enact to improve their inner culture and improve the livelihood of the employees. And that is a difficult thing, to make it empirical. What are the benchmarks? How would we know, that it's working? Because this is something we're suggesting. We would be making recommendations to these organizations to do something more than they're doing. And how do we know that they're not just wasting time throwing money away? And what my suggestion was, admittedly a little bit still nebulous, but I think it would work. And then there are ways in which I think we could have some empirical benchmarks around this, which is to implement Bildung within organizations wherein the people would have these circles of discussions where they would discuss, things that are interesting to them, perhaps, films or novels or, science. But the science would show how it's connected to their lives. All of these would connect, and this discussions on science would connect to the arts as well. So there's this flowing between that and having this practical application. I think that, if there's more of these discussions, these meetings that do cut across several different aspects of life, including the arts and current events and science and the practical application, then that would engender growth, personal growth, and the group dynamic growth as well.
Brandon, I also wanted to add, I think part of the long-term vision that I got from that group on Monday is both the kind of empirical research piece, but also the capacity to develop a toolkit, which is particularly exciting to think about practitioners, either counselors or, executive development people or political action groups. In other words, if you saw that there was a need for increased effective communication, here are some sound ways to do it. If you find that the people you're working with are suffering from a deficit of compassion, or their cognitive thinking in the system is inadequate, and so I think the long term, there's a very exciting possibility to coordinate knowledge, and so that not individual practitioners are not kind of hoping for the best based on where they got trained. but you could actually look it up. Wow, I need a better method for perspective taking skill development. Who knows how to do that? So.
Cool. Definitely.
So any additional questions for any of those, the four of us who were present at the conference?
One last question. Was there any, one thing that I was wondering about, like, okay, well, who's there? Then I found myself sort of going through just the categories of groups, in this world might be interesting, Game B, the Stoa, Rebel Wisdom, Perspectiva, Enlightenment Worldview, TOK, etc. Then it was sort of like, it'd be interesting to get a catalog of that and then see what their main frames are. And then what do they bring in and why are they all in this kind of space together in that kind of way?
Yeah, and I can tell you that one of the attendees, his name is Marcus Gabler, and he has a website he put together called Me Plateau that he was trying to catalog that. And so I was thinking similarly, in fact, because his catalog here is it's not really, it's sort of organized along the those lines, and so that would be great, if you had these organizations showing how they're related to each other, how they're topically connected. Another thing that came out of this discussion, we had some discussions about how we can interlink these different social networks. So Emerge started Mighty Networks recently, and then a few months ago Jim Russ started the one for Game B, and those kind of live in their own silos, but that if we could have some sort of a way of interoperability between them, then that almost could lead us to the point where we can give the major social network media companies like Facebook a run for their money or something. That's something, or at least have compelling alternatives to that.
I mean, I could just maybe add that a lot of people have tried to do this mapping. It's an obvious thing to try and do, and many have done it to a greater or lesser extent. For example, when I'm doing funding applications for Perspectiva, they invariably ask, "Show me your network." So we have a way of doing that. I believe Life Itself, one of the organizations that was there, they have also done a kind of mapping exercise. What maybe you're asking, Greg, that hasn't been done, I think, is a slightly more substantive take on shared theoretical commitments, maybe. Anything about sort of empirical values research that might, I'm sure there's kind of a bigger than self challenges connection. And there might well be others, but I mean, I'm not sure yet we've got to that level of specificity where it says what exactly these groups are connected by, other than some kind of, again, I want to use the word aesthetic. I know that we think of aesthetic in terms of beauty and so forth, but it's something about the sort of calling quality.
Definitely. I mean, if we use zeitgeist or spirit, it's an aesthetic cultural feel, about what's going on. That at least. Well, anyway, that's what it's an aesthetic cultural calling relative to relative to what could be. There's a calling that many people are experiencing in that space.
There is an interesting flip side to that, though, because there are times, if I'm being fully candid, when I'm in the room with Emerge, I'm thinking, so, what exactly connects me and this person? Like, what sense are we part of the same endeavor?
Yep.
And I don't always have an answer. I don't think it would be wrong to say I do. And yet, I don't know how much that matters. I'm also quite happy to be shown wrong, that maybe there is a deeper connection there that I'm not aware of yet. So, I guess for me, it'd be really interesting at times to take that networking and then be like, okay, can we specify the key pieces? Like I've spent a heck of a lot of time now with John Vervaeke. And so John Vervaeke and I are like, we synced up and we're like, oh, you came up through cognitive science and philosophy and found a meta theory for that. And I'm over here in psychology doing a very similar thing. And now that's like fused and complementary in a particular type of way. Right.
And if that was an opportunity to create a weaved thread of what various, what Game B's doing socially, Robert Conan Ryan's trying to do at a particular type of level, Barden is intellectual deep web kind of thing. I don't know. I certainly feel that, but I haven't done that systematically. It might be interesting at some point.
I mean, it's definitely post-conventional. I think that in terms of the old-fashioned developmental framework, at the very least, it's post-conventional. Yeah, and there are certain aspects to that. There's an epistemic aspect to that. There's a methodological aspect to that. There's often an identity aspect to that. Like most people in this network have more than one professional hat or more than one personal story. There's a kind of, I don't know, intra-psychic plurality going on, for want of better language. But yeah, it's an interesting piece of work to sort of, because also it makes you wonder how, we know each other and we know that there are many others within this sort of pattern, but you wonder until you specify what the pattern is, you can't know how big it is, right? Because, which comes first. Of course, there's a chicken and egg issue there, but somehow it's intriguing to begin to map it along those lines, because you might find that actually we're the silent majority, for example. And we're not so niche and radical. Actually, more people than we imagine think a bit like us. So, but that's a guess. I don't know that.
Yeah, no, but I really think there's a vacancy that our knowledge structures open up, say between spirit and matter, and people are like being called into that, into that. Yeah, to fill that. And if we get that right, that will fill a fucking vacuum in a particular kind of way quickly, if it can be. At least that's my hope. And I mean quickly over decades. I don't mean quickly like tomorrow.
Yeah, but I think that's a pretty good back of the envelope way of putting it. The gap between spirit and matter and being pulled into that vacuum together somehow. Some feeling that more acutely than others.
I'd like to add back to the Eros and the aesthetics, because I think it's playing in here. J.F. Martel, I don't know if you know about him. He's a French-Canadian artist, philosopher. And his position is that the aesthetics goes all the way down. Like there's turtles all the way down. Aesthetics is not just what we see in a museum. That whatever this is, the way you're just, I could just see you, it's like, whatever this is, but something fits or something calls you or whatever. So he has a book, and I'm sorry, I don't remember. So it's I'll put it in the chat, J.F. Martel. He's quite a outlaw.
I wonder, did Vervaeke ever mention him? Because that sounds like when Vervaeke talks about relevance realization, I think that's what it is. Like you're drawing patterns, these are aesthetic patterns that you're drawing through your experience. And that's the ground of conscious experience,
Yeah, there would be certainly something to be said by that. Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, it's funny, a stage of life thing as well. I don't know. But I when I was an undergraduate, I was asked to read On the Aesthetic Education of Man by Schiller, which was a book written just after the French Revolution, where he was asked to come to terms with how it went so wrong. And in essence, it went wrong because the revolutionaries in his view, lacked aesthetic education, by which he meant they lacked the capacity to rebuild in a different world and collapsed into the reign of terror and so forth. But I only mention that now because at the time, I remember thinking, aesthetic education, like what the fuck is that? What's he talking about? And yet now, different phase of life, I begin to feel the turtles all the way down, Danny. I begin to sense that there's something about aesthetics that we, as a culture, that when you mention spirit and matter and the gap, that's the aesthetic space, right? So my merge might be speaking to that and if so, great, I guess. Yeah.
So I put his book in the chat, Jeff Martinez.
Thank you.
So I might need to wrap up in just a couple of minutes here. I'm not sure if anybody has any concluding thoughts or anything.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Jeff. Thank everybody for coming. And I deeply appreciate it because I couldn't make it, but my spirit's over there, even though my matter was here. So it's a really, really cool. And I really do think, that we're seeding this zeitgeist and exploring how we can come together, feel what this is as we blend into the fog, and then, bring it back to our communities and our souls and actionable plans and things like that. What else can we be doing? So I appreciate all your efforts. It's really, for me, obviously, I believe it is deeply important. So.
Well, thanks for arranging this event, and good to know the gathering lived on, beyond its place and time. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I went all the way there because I had a very strong feeling that what's going on in Northern Europe. There's world-leading thought in complexity and social organization, and that we could start to bring some of that here. And there's only so much that I can learn through these sort of. If it was all remote, then that wouldn't quite get there, So I'm now. I think I have an obligation to try to improve the political and cultural situation here in the U.S. just a little bit, if we can. As Jonathan was mentioning a few minutes ago, it'll take maybe decades to get us out of the rut we're in, and I think a lot of it is that people are so ingrained in thinking and not willing to open up and imagine a new aesthetic for how we can do things here in the U.S. And then that's an incredible shame. And I don't think we even have that long, because the U.S. is so powerful, and it's things, the entire world is partially dependent on how quickly we turn the corner and reimagine a new way of living, here. So it's a huge burden, but I think I'm willing to do my part.
We'll do our Cosmo local thing. All righty. Hey, thanks, Brandon.
Take care.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you for herding the cats.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for herding the cats.